Scott Bailey's laser rifle blast tore through the alien creature's chest in an explosion of green blood, proving beyond doubt that this planet the Voxari star charts marked as abandoned was anything but dead. Scott's team had set down on the surface of VX-6837 3 days ago, eager to explore the sprawling ruins of what appeared to be an ancient Voxari city reclaimed by the planet's dense alien jungles. Orbital probes had detected rare mineral deposits, but no signs of inhabitation, making this a potential goldmine ripe for human exploitation. That illusion shattered when a massive storm descended out of nowhere on their second night, crippling their landing craft. While inspecting the damage, that's when Scott came face to face with what really lurked in those crumbling alien towers. The beast was bipedal, 9 feet tall with plated purple skin and eyes that glowed a baleful yellow when it charged out of the shadows. But as the adrenaline of the kill faded and Scott examined his trophy, an unsettling feeling crept over him. This thing, though monstrous, bore a striking resemblance to the regal Voxari statues they'd found weathered and overgrown in the city's central plaza. The next day, with the help of stun nets and sedative darts, Scott managed to capture one of the beasts. Under the bright lights of the lab aboard their orbiting research vessel, his suspicions were confirmed. This was a Voxari, or at least what was left of one. The creature, which he nicknamed Vola, had the same towering physique, distinctive head crest, and 6-digited hands as the aliens depicted in the city's faded artworks. But the refinement and intelligence of that ancient species was gone from its eyes, replaced by pure feral rage. What the hell happened here? Searching through fragmentary records and mural inscriptions, the real story of VX-6837 began to take shape. Eons ago, a virulent plague had swept through Voxari space, an extinction-level event. While the majority of their people fled to distant stars, those infected stayed behind on quarantined worlds like this one to die, preventing the spread. But Voxari physiology proved more resilient than expected. Over countless centuries in isolation, the infected survivors gradually lost their culture, technology, and even their sanity, devolving into these primitive yet lethal abominations. Despite the dangers these devolved Voxari still posed, Scott couldn't contain his excitement. This planet was an untouched living museum of one of the galaxy's most ancient and enigmatic civilizations. The scientific and cultural wealth to be gleaned here was incalculable. If humans could eliminate the beasts, they could uncover eons of lost Voxari secrets, art, and technology. It might even be possible to rehabilitate the creatures, to reclaim the legacy of a species that touched the stars when humans were still huddling in caves. But Scott's hopes turned to dread when word of the discovery reached a rival human faction known for their ruthless exploitation of alien worlds. Heavily armed company ships were already entering orbit, eager to claim this abandoned planet's resources for themselves. While Earth debated how to proceed, Scott knew if these corporate vultures landed, they would strip VX-6837 bare and exterminate the devolved Voxari without a second thought. He had to find a way to protect this world and its secrets, even from his own species. Humanity had been given a priceless glimpse into its own potential future. For Scott, that future now hinged on unraveling the mystery of the Voxari's collapse and extracting meaning from their tragic fall. Many light years from home, the race was on to see whether human curiosity or greed would define the destiny of a lost alien world, and perhaps humanity itself. Scott Bailey wipes sweat from his brow as he barks orders to his team. They work fast, setting up defenses around the base camp and key Voxari sites. Portable energy barriers hum to life, encircling ancient temples and towering statues. Automated gun turrets swivel into position, ready to repel any incursion. In the heart of the ruins, Scott approaches Vola, the captured feral Voxari. He holds up his hands, a gesture of peace. "We're here to help," Scott says, enunciating each word. "Friends." Vola snarls, baring fangs, but there's a flicker of intelligence in those yellow eyes. Slowly, Scott offers a nutrient bar. The creature sniffs it, then snatches it away. It's a start. As days turn to weeks, communication with the feral Voxari improves. They begin to tolerate the human's presence, if not quite trust, It buys Scott precious time. Inside a crumbling temple, Dr. David Weston hunches over a glowing Voxari console. Strange runes dance across the screen. "I think I'm getting somewhere," Weston mutters. "The Voxari language seems to have mathematical patterns woven into—" Weston nods grimly. "The plague, and you're right, it's not natural. This was bioengineered to target Voxari physiology." "But why, and by whom?" "That's still unclear, but look here." Weston points to a line of text. Repeated references to a place called the Vault, some kind of secret military facility. Scott's mind races. If there are answers to be found, they'll be in this vault. He starts assembling a search party. Back at the base camp, Dr. Ethan Moore marvels as he observes a group of feral Voxari. They're using crude tools, constructing basic shelters. "Fascinating," Moore says into his recorder. Despite their feral state, elements of Voxari society persist, the urge to build, to create order from chaos. Suddenly alarms blare. Soldiers rush to defensive positions as an unfamiliar shuttle streaks overhead, landing hard at the edge of the ruins. Rival faction. Pulse rifle fire shatters the tense silence. Scott's team returns fire, energy bolts scorching ancient stone. A stray shot strikes a towering Voxari statue, sending it toppling in a cloud of dust. The attack is repelled, but at a cost. Moore kneels beside a fallen scientist, frantically applying pressure to a wound. Medics rush over with a stretcher. And then a roar shakes the jungle, as Vola and the other feral Voxari melt back into the shadows, eyes filled with renewed distrust and fear. Weeks of progress, undone in moments. He turns to his team, voice low and urgent. "We have to find that vault. It's our only hope of protecting this planet, and maybe understanding what the hell happened to the Voxari." Scott checks his rifle, then strides towards the waiting search shuttle. The race against time continues, the secrets of the planet dead still tantalizingly out of reach. Scott Bailey wiped sweat from his brow as he stood before Vola and the assembled feral Voxari. The tension was palpable. He knew he had to act fast to rebuild the fragile trust shattered by the recent attack. "I'm going alone," Scott announced to his team, "to find answers." Dr. Weston protested. "That's insane. We don't know what's out there." Scott shook his head. "Exactly why I have to do this. To show we're not all a threat." He packed light, a scanner, rations, and basic survival gear. As the rising suns painted the alien sky, Scott set out into the uncharted wilderness. The jungle was dense, filled with strange flora that seemed to pulse with alien life. Scott hacked through vines as thick as his arm, following faint energy signatures on his scanner. At night, bioluminescent creatures lit up the canopy. "Volar, I hope you see this. I'm searching for the truth about your people. To help, not harm, please understand." He trekked on, scaling treacherous cliff faces and fording rivers of strange, viscous liquid. Finally, as exhaustion set in, Scott's scanner pinged. He'd found it. The entrance was hidden beneath a massive, gnarled tree. Scott pried open ancient doors and descended into darkness. Lights flickered to life, revealing a vast chamber. At its center stood a hulking computer core. Then alarms blared. Panels slid open in the walls, revealing gleaming auto turrets. Energy bolts sizzled past Scott's head as he dove for cover. "Shit!" He scrambled deeper into the facility, pulse pounding. The turrets tracked his movement, filling the air with deadly fire. Scott burst through a sealed doorway, slamming it shut behind him. He found himself in a vast chamber, filled with rows upon rows of stasis pods. Each contained a Voxari, frozen in time. Approaching the nearest pod, Scott gasped. The being inside wore ornate robes, a symbol of leadership. He checked the next, a Voxari clutching scientific instruments. He accessed a nearby terminal, downloading everything he could. What he found chilled him to the bone. The plague was no accident. It was a weapon, created by the Voxari themselves. A doomsday device that backfired horribly. Clutching this vital data, Scott knew he had to get out. He sprinted back towards the entrance, ancient security drones in hot pursuit. Energy bolts scorched the walls around him as he ran. Scott burst from the hidden entrance, not stopping until he'd put miles between himself and the facility. He didn't slow his pace until he reached the outskirts of the camp 2 days later. His team gathered around as Scott, exhausted and filthy, shared what he'd discovered. Vola listened intently, yellow eyes unblinking. "This changes everything," Dr. Weston said, reviewing the data. "If this bioweapon falls into the wrong hands—" Scott nodded grimly. "Which is why we can't let that happen. Vola," he turned to the feral Voxari, "we need to work together to protect this knowledge and maybe find a way to help your people." Volar's eyes narrowed, considering. Then slowly he extended a 6-fingered hand. Scott grasped it, a spark of hope kindling. But there was no time to celebrate this small victory. Alarms blared across the camp. The rival human faction had arrived in force, their ships descending from orbit. Scott's heart pounded as he watched the rival faction's ships descend through the atmosphere. Beside him, Vola's muscles tensed, ready for action. The feral Voxari had rallied to their cause, understanding the existential threat they all faced. "Everyone in position?" Scott barked into his comm. Affirmative responses crackled back. Dr. Weston's voice cut in. "Ancient defense systems are online, Scott. Ready when you are." Scott nodded grimly. Let's hope it doesn't come to that. He keyed up the broadband transmitter, taking a deep breath before speaking. "Attention incoming vessels. This is Scott Bailey. We possess data on an incredibly dangerous Voxari bioweapon. For the safety of all humanity, I urge you to stand down and discuss this peacefully." Human and Voxari allies alike scrambled for cover, feigning a panicked retreat. Enemy dropships roared overhead, disgorging troops and armored vehicles. Scott sprinted into the ancient facility, Volar at his heels. They raced to the control center where Weston waited. "They've breached the outer perimeter," Weston reported, eyes on the sensor feeds. Weston's fingers flew across the alien console. Outside, massive cannons burst from concealed silos tracking upward. Energy beams lanced into the sky, tearing through dropships. Explosions bloomed against the clouds. "What the—" The enemy commander's shocked voice cut off as Scott terminated the transmission. On the ground, confusion reigned. Scott grabbed his rifle. "That's our cue. Move out." He led a charge from the base. Human soldiers and feral Voxari poured from hidden tunnels and crevices, catching the invaders in a brutal crossfire. Energy weapons and bestial roars filled the air. Scott fought his way through the chaos, making for the enemy command ship. A well-placed shot dropped the guard at the entry ramp. He slipped inside, racing for the bridge. The ship's systems were familiar enough. Scott jacked in his datapad, uploading the virus he and Weston had prepared. Alarms blared as the ship's systems went haywire. He snatched a data crystal from the main computer, tucking it securely away before fighting his way back outside. The battle raged for hours, but the tide had turned. Leaderless and cut off from orbital support, the invaders were routed. Scott watched grimly as the last enemy troops fled into waiting shuttles, harried by Voxari warriors. In the aftermath, Scott surveyed the damage. The ancient base was scarred. Entire sections collapsed. Bodies of humans and Voxari littered the battlefield. He clenched his fists, the weight of lives lost settling on his shoulders. Later, in what remained of their lab, Scott pored over the stolen data. "Anything?" Weston asked. Vola growled softly in agreement. Outside, the first efforts at rebuilding were already underway. Scott knew the road ahead would be long, but for the first time since landing on this world, he felt real hope. Together, they might just forge a future neither humans nor Voxari could have imagined alone. Scott Bailey surveyed the wreckage of the ancient Voxari base, his boots crunching on shattered stone and twisted metal. The air still reeked of ozone from energy weapons fire. He paused to help a limping soldier, guiding her to a makeshift medical station where Dr. Moore worked tirelessly on the wounded. "We need to fortify," Scott said, turning to Vola. The Voxari warrior's yellow eyes gleamed with intelligence, a far cry from their first encounter. Vola nodded, gesturing towards the downed enemy ships. For days they labored. Human and Voxari alike strained to drag salvaged hull plating into place, reinforcing walls and covering exposed sections. Scott's muscles ached as he welded support struts, the searing heat of the torch a constant companion. Inside the base, Dr. Weston hunched over banks of computers, his fingers flying across alien interfaces. Data scrolled past his bloodshot eyes, a ceaseless stream of information. "Scott!" Weston called out suddenly. "I found something, coordinates, other Voxari worlds." Hope surged through Scott. He assembled a small team, selecting their most capable pilots and fighters. They boarded a battered enemy shuttle, repurposed for their mission. The journey was tense, marked by equipment failures and near misses with debris fields. As they entered the atmosphere of the nearest quarantine world, Scott's stomach knotted with anticipation. What they found defied description. The barren landscape writhed with unnatural movement. Biomechanical horrors scuttled across blasted plains, a mockery of the life they once were. Scott watched in horror as a mutated plague form tore through solid rock with ease, its body a nightmarish fusion of flesh and machine. "Get us out of here!" Scott shouted as something massive reared up, tentacles lashing at the shuttle. The pilot wrenched the controls, engines screaming as they clawed for altitude. They barely made it back to orbit, the shuttle's hull scored by corrosive attacks. Scott slumped in his seat, the weight of their discovery crushing down on him. Upon their return, he found Vola waiting. The Voxari's expression was unreadable as Scott explained what they'd seen. Slowly, Vola placed a six-fingered hand on Scott's shoulder. The gesture spoke volumes. They were in this fight together. Dr. Weston's voice crackled over the intercom. "Scott, I need you in the lab now." Scott raced through winding corridors. He found Weston staring at a holographic display, complex molecular structures rotating slowly. "The source code," Weston said, his voice barely above a whisper. "For the original bioweapon, if we can crack this—" Scott nodded grimly. "Do it, whatever it takes." As Weston dove back into his work, Scott strode to the command center. He keyed up the base-wide communication system. "Listen up," he said, his voice echoing through every corridor and chamber. "What we're facing, it's bigger than we ever imagined. But we're not giving up. Not now. Not ever. Humanity and Voxari, working together. That's our strength, and we're going to need every ounce of it." He turned to the viewport, staring out at the alien landscape. Somewhere out there, the enemy was regrouping, and on distant worlds, horrors beyond imagination waited. Scott's hand tightened on his rifle. The real fight was just beginning. The echoes of Scott's rallying cry faded, replaced by the sounds of frantic activity. Sweat dripped from his brow as he hefted a massive durasteel plate, muscles straining under the weight. Beside him, a Voxari warrior with mottled green skin grunted, its forearms working in unison to position the armor. A series of clicks and growls answered him. Scott's translator crackled to life. "Progressing. Weapon systems salvaged from 3 enemy ships. Power cores unstable." Inside the base, the air hummed with the constant whir of computers. Dr. Weston hunched over a holographic display, lines of alien code scrolling past his bloodshot eyes. Empty stimpaks littered the floor around him. "Any progress?" Scott asked, approaching cautiously. Weston didn't look up. "Maybe. The encryption's like nothing I've seen, but there's a pattern, I think." A shrill alarm cut through the air. Scott sprinted to the command center, skidding to a halt before the main view screen. His blood ran cold at the sight. A mass of writhing tendrils filled the display, metallic surfaces gleaming beneath layers of pulsing flesh. As they watched, the horror consumed an asteroid, breaking it down to component molecules in seconds. "Sir," a technician called out, voice shaking, "it's on an intercept course." Scott's mind raced. He studied the star chart, a desperate plan forming. "There," he pointed to a barren moon. "We lure it there, use the enemy ship's weapons to keep its attention, then trap it with a force field." Dr. Weston burst into the room, face pale. "Scott, you can't be serious. The energy required... If it breaks free..." "We're out of options," Scott cut him off. He turned to the comm officer. "Get me Vola." Within hours, Scott stood on the bridge of a captured enemy vessel, a skeleton crew at their stations. 2 other ships flanked them, weapon systems primed. "Remember," Scott's voice carried across the shared channel, "we hit it hard, fast, and keep moving. Don't let it touch you." They screamed out of the atmosphere, engines burning hot. The plague entity loomed before them, impossibly vast. Scott's hands tightened on the controls. Now! Energy lanced from their ships, carving furrows in the monstrosity's surface. It reacted instantly, tendrils lashing out with terrifying speed. Scott barrel-rolled, feeling the ship shudder as a glancing blow struck their hull. For agonizing minutes they danced a deadly ballet. One of their ships erupted in flames, consumed by the relentless assault. Scott gritted his teeth, pushing his vessel to its limits. Finally they cleared the moon's atmosphere. Scott's targeting computer locked onto pre-placed energy pylons. Initiating force field, now! A shimmering barrier sprang to life, catching the plague entity mid-lunge. It thrashed wildly, tendrils splaying across the energy field. The moon's surface bubbled and writhed as the horror began to assimilate it. Scott sagged in his chair, adrenaline still coursing through his veins. "We did it," he breathed. But their victory was short-lived. Alarms blared as the force field fluctuated wildly. On the moon's surface, the entity pulsed with malevolent purpose. "It's probing for weaknesses," Scott realized aloud. "This thing, it's smart." A new alert echoed through the chaos. Scott's eyes widened as he read the sensor data. No. Enemy ships dropped out of hyperspace, weapons hot. Their comms crackled to life, filled with the sounds of biomechanical horror. Scott punched the ship-to-surface channel. "Vola, we've got incoming. The entity called for reinforcements somehow. Prepare for a 2-pronged assault." He stared at the force field, watching it flicker ominously. They'd contained the plague, but for how long? And at what cost? Scott opened a channel to the lab. "Weston, tell me you've got something, anything." "I'm close." Weston's voice was strained. "But Scott, and I don't know if we have enough time." Scott watched as the enemy fleet drew closer, their ships jam-packed with weapons. Behind them, the trapped plague entity pulsed with murderous intent. He took a deep breath, steeling himself for the fight to come. Scott's fingers flew across the control panel, rerouting power and sealing off damaged sections of the ship. Alarms blared as enemy vessels closed in, their weapons primed. "All hands to battle stations," he barked into the comm. "Defensive positions now." On the planet below, Vola's guttural roar echoed through the base. Voxari warriors scrambled to their posts, their clawed feet scraping against metal floors. Human soldiers hefted energy rifles, taking cover behind hastily erected barricades. Scott's eyes darted between holographic displays, assessing their dwindling resources. The force field containing the plague entity flickered ominously, tendrils of biomechanical horror probing its edges. "Weston," Scott called over the comm, "we're out of time. I need options." The scientist's voice crackled back, strained and exhausted. "I'm close, Scott. But this code, it's unlike anything I've seen." His hands danced across the controls, bypassing safety protocols. Warning messages flashed across the screen, but Scott ignored them. The ship's core hummed dangerously, energy levels spiking. On the surface, dropships descended through a hail of defensive fire. Volar crouched behind a fallen pillar, signaling to his warriors. As the first enemy troops hit the ground, the Voxari sprang their trap. Bestial roars filled the air as Voxari warriors surged from hidden positions. Taken by surprise, the first wave of attackers fell in seconds, torn apart by razor-sharp claws and precise energy blasts from human defenders. Scott watched the battle unfold on his tactical display, a grim smile on his face. But the victory was short-lived. More dropships appeared on the horizon, disgorging waves of heavily armed troops. "Sir," a young technician called out, "we can't maintain this output. The reactors are redlining." Scott nodded, his face set. "Push them harder. We only need a few more minutes." On the ground, Vola's forces fell back under the relentless assault. Explosions rocked the outpost as enemy fire found its mark. The Voxari commander's voice growled over the comm, thick with static and the sounds of battle. Scott took a deep breath, steeling himself. "Get everyone you can into the bunkers. We're going to overload the reactors. One last push to take out that thing once and for all." Volar's acknowledgement was lost in a burst of static. Scott turned to his crew, meeting their eyes one by one. "It's been an honor. Initiate final sequence." Energy surged through the failing ships, pouring into the force field below. The plague entity writhed as the field intensified, its very atoms beginning to tear apart. On the planet's surface, Vola herded the last defenders into reinforced bunkers. Outside, a wall of searing energy swept across the battlefield. Enemy troops caught in the open simply ceased to exist, vaporized in an instant. The ships in orbit came apart at the seams, unable to contain the catastrophic energy release. Scott closed his eyes as a blinding light engulfed the bridge. When it faded, an eerie silence fell over the scarred landscape. Vola emerged from the bunker, blinking in the strange radioactive glow that lit the sky. His comm unit crackled to life. "Vola," Scott's voice came through, weak but alive. "The entity, it's gone, but so is everything else." The Voxari warrior surveyed the devastation. Their outpost lay in ruins, ammunition stores depleted, and with them any hope of unraveling the bioweapons' secrets. "What now, Scott?" Vola asked, his voice heavy. Scott's response was grim but unwavering. "We survive, whatever it takes." Scott's boots crunched on shattered glass and twisted metal as he emerged from the bunker. The acrid stench of burning plastics and ozone assaulted his nostrils. Beside him, Vola's 4 eyes blinked rapidly, adjusting to the apocalyptic landscape. "By the eternal void," the Voxari warrior breathed, his translator struggling to convey the depth of his shock. Where a bustling outpost once stood, only smoking craters remained. Twisted girders reached skyward like skeletal fingers. In the distance, a storage tank belched flames, casting an eerie glow over the devastation. "Set up triage in the central bunker," Scott barked, "and get me a team. We need to find Weston's lab." As the rescue efforts began, Scott and Vola trudged through the wreckage. They passed a group of human soldiers hauling debris off a trapped Voxari, its chitinous exoskeleton cracked but intact. Scott nodded grimly. "Agreed, but we need those defense turrets. It's all we've got left." They set to work, Scott's muscles screaming as he hefted a fallen beam. Nearby, a mixed team of humans and Voxari struggled to right an overturned weapons platform. A shout drew their attention. One of the scouts, face streaked with soot, came sprinting across the ruined courtyard. "Commander," she gasped. "Enemy ships, they survived. They're landing troops on the far side of the caldera." Scott's stomach lurched. He glanced at their meager defenses, then at Vola. The Voxari's expression was unreadable, but the set of his shoulders spoke volumes. "We're out of options," Scott said, his voice low. "We need that bioweapon data. It's our only chance." He keyed his comm, calling for volunteers. Within minutes, a battered personnel carrier roared to life, its armor pockmarked with blast damage. "I'll lead the rescue team," Scott announced, checking the charge on his rifle. "Vola, can you hold them off?" The Voxari warrior chittered an affirmative. "We will buy you time, human, but do not waste it." As Scott climbed aboard the carrier, the first impacts shook the ground. Enemy fire rained down on their hastily erected barricades. Volar bellowed orders, his warriors returning fire with desperate intensity. The carrier lurched forward, ploughing through debris. Scott clung to a handhold, scanning the shattered landscape for landmarks. Where Weston's lab once stood, only a smoking crater remained. "There," one of the crew shouted, pointing to a half-collapsed structure. Scott leapt from the still-moving vehicle, sprinting toward the ruins. He stumbled, nearly falling into a yawning fissure in the earth. The ground trembled beneath his feet as artillery strikes drew closer. "Weston!" he shouted, voice raw. "Dr. Weston!" A muffled voice answered. Scott dropped to his knees, clearing rubble with frantic speed. A hatch appeared, its surface scarred but intact. The hatch creaked open, revealing Weston's haggard face. "Scott, thank God." They hauled the scientist and his team from the sub-basement, along with several sealed containers. As they loaded the precious cargo, a piercing whine filled the air. "Incoming!" Scott roared. The world exploded. Scott felt himself lifted off his feet, hurled through the air like a rag doll. He slammed into the ground, vision swimming. Through the ringing in his ears, he heard screams of pain and the staccato beat of weapons fire. Forcing himself to his knees, Scott saw the carrier reduced to burning wreckage. Weston lay nearby, clutching one of the data packs to his chest. Enemy troops advanced through the smoke, weapons raised. He opened fire, the recoil jarring his battered body. 2 enemy soldiers fell, but more kept coming. Scott felt a searing pain in his side as a shot found its mark. He stumbled, vision narrowing. A familiar battle cry split the air. Volar charged from the smoke, his warriors at his back. The Voxari slammed into the enemy line with terrifying force, buying precious seconds. Strong hands grabbed Scott, hauling him toward safety. He saw Weston and the others disappear into the bunker entrance. With a final burst of effort, Scott threw himself inside. The massive doors slammed shut, locking with a resounding clang. In the sudden silence, Scott sank to the floor, gasping for breath. Volar limped toward him, ichor oozing from a dozen wounds. "We made it," Scott wheezed. Scott nodded, forcing himself to stand. He looked at the battered survivors crowding the bunker, then at the sealed data packs Weston clutched. "Then we'd better get to work," Scott said. Scott's fingers flew across the control panel, rerouting power to the bunker's shielding. The walls shuddered as another barrage slammed into the surface above. A young technician wiped sweat from her brow. "Shields holding at 62%, sir, but we can't take much more of this." Scott nodded grimly. He turned to Dr. Weston, who hunched over a workbench surrounded by scorched data packs and hastily assembled equipment. "Talk to me, Doctor. What have we got?" Weston looked up, his eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep. 3 data packs recovered from the lab, 2 are completely fried, but the third... He tapped a battered device. "This one's got something. My team's working on decryption now." He strode to the makeshift armory where survivors distributed their dwindling cache of weapons. A grizzled sergeant handed out energy cells, his voice gruff. 1 pack each. Make every shot count. In the command center, Volar loomed over a holographic map. His mandibles clicked as he addressed a group of Voxari warriors. "Scout in pairs. Map every tunnel, every crevice. We need escape routes and supply caches." Scott joined him, studying the terrain. "How bad is it?" Volar's 4 eyes blinked in sequence. "Bad. Long-range sensors show multiple waves inbound. We have days at most." For nearly a week, they endured. The bunker trembled under sporadic bombardments. During lulls, Volar's scouts slipped out, returning with precious food, water, and salvaged munitions. On the 5th day, a shout echoed through the command center. "We've got it." Scott rushed to Weston Station. The scientist's hands shook as he pulled up a stream of data. "It's the bioweapons base genome. We can replicate it, modify it to target." Weston opened his mouth to argue, but a junior technician interrupted. "Sir, there's something else in the code. It's not normal." They crowded around the screen. Scott's blood ran cold as the implications sank in. Machine code interwoven with genetic sequences. An artificial intelligence, buried in the virus itself. Weston protested. "But Scott, if we could control it—" "We can't." Scott thumped his hand on the console. "That thing nearly wiped us out. We're not giving it another chance." He paced, mind racing. Then it hit him. "The fabricators. Could we build something to target those AI routines? A kind of genetic scrubber?" Weston's eyes widened. "Theoretically, yes, but we'd need time." A violent tremor rocked the bunker. Alarms blared as the enemy assault intensified. Scott keyed his comm. "Volar, they're making their push. How long can we hold?" Scott took a deep breath. Then we make every minute count. Doctor, you've got a job to do. As Weston's team raced to prototype the scrubber device, Scott climbed to an observation post. Through reinforced viewports, he watched Volar lead a squad of Voxari warriors in hit-and-run attacks against the advancing enemy. Energy bolts crisscrossed the ravaged landscape. A Voxari fell, his exoskeleton shattered. Volar dragged the wounded warrior to safety, acid blood hissing against the scorched earth. Scott's comm crackled. "Sir, we're almost out of energy cells, 2 hours of power, tops." He closed his eyes, steeling himself. When he opened them, his voice was steady. "Understood, prepare for a final stand." The scientist didn't look up. "Getting there. But Scott, even if this works, how do we deliver it?" Scott's gaze fell on the tactical display, zeroing in on the enemy command center. A plan formed, desperate and dangerous. "We take the fight to them," he said. "One last push." He turned to Volar, who limped into the room, ichor oozing from fresh wounds. "I need your best warriors. We're going to punch through their lines and hit that command post." As the bunker shuddered under renewed assault, Scott laid out his plan. They would hold the line here, buying time for Weston to finish the scrubber. Meanwhile, Volar would lead a strike team to deliver the payload. Scott looked at the haggard faces around him, human and Voxari alike united in desperation. "This is our last shot," he said. "Let's make it count." He turned to Dr. Weston, who hunched over the cobbled-together purge device. The scientist's hands trembled as he made final adjustments to the anti-proton accelerator. "How much longer?" Scott asked, his voice tight. Weston didn't look up. "Minutes, maybe less." "Sir!" A young soldier burst into the room, face streaked with grime. "They've breached the outer defenses. We can't hold them back much longer." Scott nodded grimly. "Fall back to the central core. Set the traps as we planned." As the soldier rushed to relay the orders, Scott caught Volar's four-eyed gaze. The Voxari warrior stood tall, mandibles clicking softly. Scott clasped the alien's chitinous arm. "Good hunting, my friend." Volar turned to his hand-picked squad of Voxari fighters. Their exoskeletons bore the scars of countless battles. "Warriors of the eternal void," Volar addressed them in their native tongue. "Today we embrace the great darkness, for our people, for our allies." The Voxari clicked and chittered in response, a sound like steel on stone. As Volar led his strike team towards the auxiliary escape tunnel, Scott raced to oversee the final preparations. The corridors echoed with the sounds of combat drawing ever closer. In the outermost chamber, a squad of human defenders crouched behind hastily erected barricades. Their weapons were trained on the main entrance, which buckled under repeated impacts. "Hold your fire," Scott ordered. "Wait for my signal." The bulkhead finally gave way with a screech of tortured metal. Enemy troops poured through the breach, their alien forms barely visible through the smoke and dust. The defenders opened fire, their energy weapons cutting down the first wave of attackers. But more kept coming. "Blow it," he ordered. A thunderous explosion rocked the bunker. The outer chamber became an inferno, as thermobaric charges detonated, incinerating the enemy forces trapped inside. In that moment of chaos, Volar's strike team slipped out through their escape route, launching their desperate mission to the enemy command center. Back in the heart of the bunker, Dr. Weston's voice cut through the din. "It's ready." Scott rushed to the scientist's side. The purge device hummed ominously, its improvised components barely contained within a hastily welded frame. "One shot," Weston said, his voice hoarse. "That's all we've got." Scott nodded, keying his comm. "All units fall back to the purge chamber. This is our last stand." As if in response, a shrill alarm cut through the air. Radiation warnings flashed on nearby displays. "The device," Weston gasped, "is destabilizing." Weston shook his head. "Not here. We need to vent it now." "Do it," Scott ordered, already moving. "Everyone out. Clear the adjacent room." Soldiers and scientists scrambled to evacuate as Scott manually overrode the airlock controls. With a hiss of escaping air, the purge device's energies spilled into the now empty chamber. The respite was brief. A deafening explosion signaled another breach. Enemy troops poured into the bunker's inner sanctum. "Protect the device," Scott roared, raising his weapon. What followed was a desperate melee. Human and Voxari defenders fought side by side, using every scrap of cover in the confined space. Energy bolts crisscrossed the air, leaving scorch marks on walls and bodies alike. Through it all, Weston and his remaining team worked frantically to stabilize the purge device. One by one, they fell to enemy fire. "Scott!" Weston called out, his voice barely audible over the din of battle. "It's now or never." Scott looked around the chamber. His forces were spent, their weapons running dry. With grim determination, he gave the order to fall back into the purge chamber itself. As the last defender stumbled through, Scott sealed the door. He turned to Weston, who stood at the device's controls. Weston nodded, his fingers dancing across the panel. The purge device thrummed to life, building to a crescendo. A blinding flash filled the chamber. Scott felt an indescribable sensation as the anti-proton beam washed over him. He watched in horrified fascination as his comrades' bodies seemed to unravel before his eyes. His last conscious thought was a fervent hope that their sacrifice would be enough to end the plague that had brought them to this point. Above ground, Vola led the charge into the enemy command center. His warriors fought with savage intensity, knowing each moment bought was precious. As alarms blared and enemy troops converged on their position, Vola activated the bio-explosives they had carried. He felt a moment of grim satisfaction as the devices detonated. Then came a roar unlike anything he had ever heard. A wall of energy expanded outward from the direction of the bunker, consuming everything in its path. Vola's last thoughts were of his people, of the hope that this act might lead to their redemption. Then the wave hit, and everything ceased to be. In the aftermath, silence reigned. The once bustling battlefield was now a wasteland of ash and twisted metal. No living thing stirred. A solitary drone hovered above the devastation, its sensors probing the wreckage. It detected faint signals buried deep beneath the rubble. Improbably, something had survived. The drone's processors whirred as it compiled its report. Its antenna extended, beaming a tightly encrypted message into the void of space. "Subjects terminated, abort quarantine, cycle reset required, calculating." You have reached the end of the story. If you enjoyed this story and want to support us, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel, and for every comment that says 88, I will heart every single one of them. Thank you for your time.